widow of Devil Ants Hatfield, died at the family homestead up near the head of Island Creek at about 8 o'clock this morning. Though she was frail and had been in ill health all winter, the news of her passing caused much surprise and regret among relatives and friends. March 15, 1929.
Sometimes to move forward, we must go back to the beginning to understand. Lavisi Chafin Hatfield was the wife of Devil Ants Hatfield. Devil Ants' real name was William Anderson Hatfield. Devil was a nickname. They also called him Bad Andy back then, which a lot of people may not know, but I see that in numerous old articles that I read. Devil Ants was the patriarch of the Hatfield Clan during the Hatfield McCoy feud along the Big Sandy River in the West Virginia-Kentucky border between 1863 and 1891. He led the Hatfields of West Virginia while old Randolph McCoy led the McCoys of Kentucky. The rivalry resulted in more than a dozen killed from both sides and 9 Hatfields imprisoned. Devil Ants survived the feud, and he agreed to put it to an end around 1891. She was born and reared on Mate Creek in what was then Logan County but is now Mingo. She's the daughter of Nathaniel and Matilda Varney Chafin. In her teens she was married to a neighborhood youth and friend. His name was William Anderson Hatfield. William entered the Confederate Army and attained the rank of a captain. That was a trying experience for her. But a longer and more terrifying one came in the early 1880s when her family became involved in the now historic private war with the McCoys, a large family living on the Kentucky side of the Tug River. Tragedies still cast their shadows across their pathway. Chief of those was the slaying of her sons, Troy and Elias. This had nothing to do with the feud, but it was over alcohol distribution. They also, like most people at that time, had numerous deaths of grandchildren, daughter-in-laws. If anyone's watched my videos, you can just see the numerous deaths that plagued that family along with the McCoys. It was just part of the times. But it was still painful. They were still humans. As I said earlier, Lavisi and Devil Ants was married in 1861, and between 1862 and 1890, they had 9 sons and 4 daughters. Their firstborn, Johnsy Hatfield, was born in 1862. His siblings in order of birth were Cap Hatfield, also known as William Anderson Jr., Robert Lee, known as Bob, Nancy Bell, they called her Nanny, Elliot Rutherford, Mary Hatfield, Elizabeth, they called Betty, Elias Hatfield, Detroit, they called Troy, Joseph, they called Joe, Rosetta Lee, they called Rosie or Rosa, Emmanuel Willis, they called Willis, Tennyson Samuel, they just called Tennis. None of their children were killed during the feud, unlike Randall McCoy, who lost 5. Hers was a stout heart, otherwise it could not have withstood the storms that raged about her home and her family for many years. But long before her interesting life ended, peace and contentment had come into her life, and her declining days were brightened by the successes that had come to her through her children and her grandchildren. Contrary to popular belief, they were not just poor, dumb hillbillies. They actually had quite a bit of money and success. Their children, even though, they had some wildness about them at times. Elliot became a doctor. They had a couple lawyers in the family. They even had a governor. So she did take pride, and a lot of the family changed as they aged, like most people do. And by the time Lavisi was ending the end of her life, her children had matured. They were family people now. She was devoted to her home and family, and her home as well as herself was widely known for hospitality. She was a member of the Church of Christ and was baptized along with her husband by Uncle Dyke Garrett some years before her husband's death, which I did a video on that. It's called The Man That Saved the Devil. It's also rumored that Cap Hatfield got saved at that time as well. And considering that Cap had been shot 3 times at this point and killed multiple people, it was probably a pretty good idea. Lavisi and Devil-Anse were married around 60-ish years. They withstood many storms, they saw many things, and they always stuck together, reared their family, and seemed to be happy. But everything comes to an end. When Devil-Anse died in 1921, Lavisi's world was shattered. The following articles come from the Logan Banner, West Virginia, which is a newspaper. This is from June 1927. Lavisi Hatfield, widow of Devil-Anse Hatfield, continues to recuperate from a serious illness and is now able to walk about the home of her daughter, Mrs. F.M. Browning of Holden, where she is being cared for. She is 84 years old. September 20th, 1927. Mrs. Lavisi Hatfield, widow of the late Devil-Anse Hatfield, is suffering from injuries received in a fall at her home Sunday. She hurt her hip and shoulder and forehead, and her condition was some as to cause some concern. Yet she was able to sit up yesterday. 2 or 3 of her daughters are helping to take care of her. She is 85. January 18th, 1929. In recovering from her recent severe illness, Mrs. Lavisi Hatfield, widow of the late Devil-Anse, has again demonstrated her remarkable vitality. Though in her 87th year, she is now recovering from pneumonia, from which she was stricken on December 28th. Monday of this week, her lungs began to clear up, and her son, Sheriff Joe Hatfield, said yesterday that she seemed to be assured of recovery. So critical was her illness for several days that half a dozen physicians were summoned to her bedside. These included Dr. H.D. Hatfield, and it has a list. I won't bore you with it. Hatfield celebrated her 86th birthday at the Hatfield homestead near Island Creek on December 20th. March 15th, 1929. Mrs. Lavisi Hatfield died at her family homestead up near the head of Island Creek about 8 o'clock this morning. Though she was frail and had been in ill health all winter, the news of her passing has caused much surprise and regret among relatives and friends, outnumbered. Still, her condition yesterday was unsatisfactory, indicating she'd suffered a back set. Hatfield celebrated her 86th birthday December 20th. 8 days later, she was stricken with pneumonia, and for several weeks her condition has been alarming. Despite her advanced age, her grit and wiry strength and endurance has triumphed, having, as she did, the tender, constant care of her children and other kinfolk, neighbors, and friends. Logan Banner, March 9th, 1929. News of the death of Devil-Anse's widow travels far and wide. Great crowd at the funeral of Mrs. Hatfield. Hundreds of relatives and friends and neighbors paid their last tribute of affection to Mrs. Hatfield Sunday afternoon. It is declared to be, by persons capable of judging, the largest funeral crowd ever assembled in the county. But on Sunday, people were coming and going for an hour or more until the services were concluded. Early in the afternoon, a crowd began to form, both at the Hatfield Cemetery and the homestead. A cool, steady, stiff breeze made it uncomfortable for those who gathered at the cemetery, with the result that they did not tarry long there, and on account of the weather conditions, a great many did not leave their cars, which were closely parked along both sides of the highway from Sheriff Joe Hatfield's home up to beyond their home. The attendance at Sunday's rites exceeded that of the funeral of Mrs. Hatfield's widely known husband, Devil-Anse, which was held on Sunday, January 9th, 1921. All over the country, the news of Mrs. Hatfield's death was flashed, and it called forth much comment on the old Hatfield McCoy feud that for a long time held the close attention, evidently, of millions of newspaper readers. So, of course, I always like to look at the death certificate. Sometimes I'll give you information that you can't find otherwise. This is Lavisi Hatfield's death certificate. She's 86. Father's Nathaniel, mother's Matilda. And it said she died of myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. And that is that. Perhaps Lavisi is yet again with her husband. Rest in peace, Lavisi Chafin. It's really kind of weird to be so close to all of them. Elias and Troy over there. Devilance, Lavisi, Johnsy. All the players you hear about, but they're just people. Just people made famous by a small feud in the Appalachians.